See. Hi everyone, welcome back. And starting a little early because I don't know if it's just being me, but I don't know, YouTube has been like really. I mean, I get it. YouTube has to make money somehow, and or actually Google, since they're part of that. But I'm like, man, they've been like super aggressive with all their ads lately. So I'm giving a little head start because people have been like, I mean, at least when I try to tune into something, especially another person's live stream, I'm like, oh, I have to watch how much minutes of ads, and it's just like, oh, whatever. But yeah, okay. So it's 1:30 now. Let's get on. So we finished with bone tissue. Now let's actually talk about the anatomy. And again, a lot of anatomy is learning new vocabulary, learning new geography of the body, and identifying different body parts. So you're going to be adding all of these new terms to your vocabulary. So it's a lot of memorization. It's like learning a new language. In fact, there's a common saying that when you're learning anatomy and physiology, you are learning a new language. And you essentially are, because a lot of anatomy and physiological terms are based in Latin and Greek. And unless you've studied Latin and Greek, this might be totally new to you. Okay, so let's talk about the skeleton, and there are two main subdivisions of the skeleton. So there's the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. And there are 206 standard bones in the normal human skeleton. Again, sometimes you might have extra small bones, but we're not quite counting that for this class. They can exist, but there are 206 that pretty much is found in all normal human skeletons. So we're going to start off with the axial skeleton, and it includes all of these bones right here. So axial sounds like axis, right? And when you have like something rotating around an axis, it's rotating around a central line. So just like the Earth revolves around its axis, same with the axial skeleton. It's central to your body. Now here is showing, so this image shows most of the bones of your axial skeleton. So your skull, your vertebrae, or sometimes commonly called spinal column, your rib cage, and then also this part right here. But the thing is, like, the other thing is that this image doesn't show everything. So what we also have is the hyoid bone. And hopefully we'll have time at the end of this lecture to talk about this hyoid bone, but it's not really part of your skull. In fact, it's very special because it doesn't actually touch any other bone, but it's very important. And where can you find it? Well, you can find it kind of like just below your chin and at the top of your neck. So that's where you would find the hyoid bone, just tucked behind there. And then there's also the auditory ossicles. We cover here the sense of hearing at the very end of this semester, but know that these aren't quite like, these are small little tiny bones you actually find through. So these are the malleus, incus, and stapes, but we cover them more in detail. We'll put them off until the end of the semester, but they are part of your axial skeleton. They are contained within your inner ear of your skull. Okay, so what is the axial skeleton? Or actually, I should say they're within your ear of skull. Okay, so what's the axial skeleton? Well, think about it this way. You're in the dorms, or say you're like, yeah, because people are back in the dorms, right? But what is the axial skeleton? Well, the thing is that pretend you wake up in the dorms and, oh, it's Halloween, and oh, you find out that in addition to Corona, we have a new outbreak. We have a zombie outbreak. And then you find out you see all the other students outside in the court, and they're milling about. And what do you do with zombies? How do you get rid of a zombie? Well, you have to get rid of them in certain ways, right? And maybe you can use an axe. You find a fire axe, and where are you going to chop? Are you just going to chop randomly to get rid of a zombie? So ideally, you can bash them in the head, or you can cut off their head itself. Although I think in Walking Dead now the head can actually be like animated by itself, but typically you attack the axial skeleton of the undead. Or how about another undead example? So not this vampires, like this is, well, let's talk about the old type vampires, another type of undead, like the Nosferatu old school type of vampire. How do you kill a vampire? Well, maybe you can also attack their axial skeleton. So say you have an axe and you break apart the coffin. So how do you get rid of the old school vampires? Well, maybe you can take a stake and drive it through the heart. And so you have to kind of drive it through the heart. You have to go through the rib cage and sternum. So that's also part of the axial skeleton. So the little mnemonic, you can kill the undead by attacking their axial skeleton with an axe. Alright, so then let's talk about that skull, that big part, that big bone, complex of bone that protects that very important organ inside your head, right? So you have the 8 cranial bones that protect the brain. So this is why it's very important to know the skull. I mean, this is why you have all that bone surrounding that. You want to protect that very vital organ. And there's also 14 facial, and again, not all face. So this is again going to make up the structure of your face. So these also not only like form part of your skull, but you have a lot of openings to the inside of your body in your face, right? So it makes sense you kind of want to protect things, or things like your eyes and your inner passages. You want to protect that with bones. So this is one other reason why we have bones, not just for structure, but also protection. And this is what the skull looks like if you took a cross section and took out that big old brain. So you may have heard the term, someone said like, maybe you should use your cranium. So cranium, what's housed inside your cranium? This big squishy organ that's very important to your life and living. So again, this is why you want to have a very solid case surrounding this. Okay, so we covered the brain more in detail on Unit 3, but let's just talk about what covers it. So what are the cranial bones? Well, here's a quick mnemonic. What are you after an anatomy exam? You are pissed off. And yeah, so what does that mean, pest? So this is a mnemonic telling you the first letters of all of the cranial bones you can find out. But you may be like, wait, did you say there were 8? I only count 6 here. Well, in the adult skull, what happens is that some of these fuse, but some of them are still paired. So in the adult skull, you have 2 parietal bones left and right. You also have 2 temporal bones, but I mean, okay, so then in terms of like frontal bones, do I want you to know like, okay, first the frontal bones, they start off separate, but it fuses together. Maybe that's for an advanced A&P, but for the adult skull, this is what you typically find. And you find these 8 cranial bones. All right, so this is another term that kind of trips you up, or could trip you up. It tripped me up when I first started. It's like you hear this term articulation, you're like, wait, what? So when you think of someone who's articulate, you think of someone who's not me. They're good at speaking, they're very well spoken, they're eloquent, they're able to tell great stories, and they're just like have the gift of gab. But articulate in terms of anatomy refers to what articulations. So what are articulations? In terms of joints and bones and skeletons, it's basically where 2 bones join together and form a joint. So that means these bones touch. So if it says like, what articulates with this bone, basically it's asking what bones or what structures touch this bone. So when they're touched, they articulate. You know, anatomy always has to make things very more complicated, but that's what we have to deal with. Alright, so the frontal bone, super easy. What's in front? What's in the skull? Your forehead. Yeah, frontal bones, super easy. Right up in front and center. Now, parietal bones. So this is kind of interesting. So notice that the parietal bones are at the top, but to the side. So again, you have 2 parietal bones, a left and right. So you can think of it like, say you have a splitting headache and you feel like, oh my god, it feels like my parietal bones could pry apart. So this is so one way you can remember where the parietal bones are. Like when you have a headache, you're kind of holding the parietal bones right here. Now then parietal bones, so temporal bones. If you're rubbing your temples, maybe you want to go a little lower, right? A little more inferior. So these are still on the sides, but again, not all the way up here with the parietal bones. Now it's like a little here. And you might be like, tempo, doesn't that refer to time? And I've seen one etymology explanation saying that, oh, temporal refers to like when we age, and including me, I start to get some gray hairs there, but it's like they say you gray on your temples first, so you can think of that. When somebody has the gray sides to their hair as they're entering their middle ages, that can be it. Like, so that's time and the graying of the temporal bones. Or if you're rubbing your temples, that's what you're doing right here. Okay, so temporal and then occipital bones. So this is an interesting one, and I think I saw a clever drawing. So here is the occipital bone. So this is in the back, and you can actually, if you have really prominent external occipital protuberance, you might feel a little bump in the back of your skull, and that's where your occipital bone is. So your occipital bone, do I have a mnemonic for that? Well, oh, I thought I had a mnemonic for that, but think of it this way. Think of like there's an octopus and it attaches itself to the back of your head. Like you're swimming and then it kind of hits the back of your head. So it sucks onto the back of your head. So think of that. Occipital sound is like octopus on your occipital bone. So notice that these all are kind of sewn together with these little lines right here. So just like sutures stitch up a wound, cranial sutures stitch up these bones of your cranium together. So what we have here is between the frontal bones and your parietal bones is your cranial sutures. But the thing is that, why do these form? Well, this is an infant skull, and notice that it doesn't quite have it completely fused yet. So these do fuse during development. And when they diffuse, you no longer have this membrane between these bones. Now these bones are completely knitted together. So this cranial suture right here, this coronal suture, is what was originally some sort of what was originally connective tissue that eventually the bones started to grow and fuse together. Yeah, it's a legal hit in boxing, especially the occipital bone, and we'll get to that too, because it's like, not only is the occipital bone there, but if you go a little lower, you don't have any bone there, and you have actually very important brain structures, especially the brainstem, just below that, and spinal cord. So this is why it's like, okay, yeah, you definitely want to get hit from the back. Okay, so fontanelles. So what are these? Well, it's very interesting. Oh, I thought I had another slide, but Okay, more sutures. So sagittal suture. This is the one that links the two parietal bones left and right together. And notice that it's right along that sagittal plane. Oh, good thing I'm not on Twitch. I had to have to censor that. But we're on YouTube. They allow educational stuff. But yeah, sagittal suture. Notice that it's right straight down along that mid-sagittal plane. And then what we have here with the coronal suture, this is the one that goes like, okay, everyone thinks corona, they think something else. But when you have a coronation, where do you put the crown? You put the crown over here like this. So think of that with the coronal suture. It's kind of like where you would have a tiara or some sort of crown or headband. And then in the back toward the posterior, so this is the back of the skull. I think there was I used to test on, there was a student who said, like, isn't that the coronal suture? And I'm like, what is missing here? It's like, do you just have bones right here in front of your eyes? And it's like, no, this is the back of your skull. So the occipital, what we have here is what we call the lambdoid suture. And we might be a lambdoid. It's like lamb as in sheep. No, it refers to something called the Greek letter lambda. So if you're in part of a sorority or fraternity, you might be or studied Greek, you might know the Greek alphabet. So lambda, notice that it's more like an upside down V, so it's kind of pointy. So it's like, okay, does that really look like a lambda? I mean, it's kind of interesting, like depending on the person, sometimes people do have kind of a pointed lambdoid suture, but basically it's just some sort of arch. Sometimes it's more curved like this one, sometimes it's more pointed, but this is where that term comes from, lambdoid suture. Yeah. Sagittal and median plane. Yeah, so there's a median plane, so median referring to just straight down the middle. Yeah. Okay, and there's also this other one called the squamous suture. So this one uses that definition of squamous where scale-like, so they say it looks scaly, but it's really hard to tell in the pictures in your book. So just take their word for it, and it links the parietal bone and the temporal bone. But the thing is that it doesn't actually extend all the way to the occipital bone. There is a smaller suture called the parietal mastoid suture. So yeah, even though it looks like part of the same line, it actually stops just before here. But I think that's like a little more detail than you need at this level. But just know that you have main sutures that link all the cranial bones in your head. Oh, so back to fontanelles. So here we have the skull of an infant, and notice that the parietal bones, they don't have the sagittal suture. And the frontal bones, they started out separate, but they actually become one fused bone in an adult. So again, this is kind of a point of curiosity, but what we have here are these squishy membranes that are called fontanelles. So fontanelles are basically the intersections of these sheets of membranes. So what we have here, so sometimes people call it the soft spot. So if there's a very newborn infant, you might notice that don't be poking like a baby's skulls without the parents' permission. They might be like, what are you doing? But say you have you're very close and you have like a nephew or niece, and then it's like, okay, yeah, so you might notice that they have a little squishy spot. And what we have here is actually this infant actually has some potential health problem. So because this is squishy membrane and not quite bone yet, what happens is that if you have less fluid or too much fluid in the skull, this spot right here can sink in or bulge out. So what we see with this infant is that it's kind of recessed a bit, so it's kind of sunken in, meaning that maybe this infant might be a little dehydrated. So dehydration and this inward sinking in of this anterior fontanelle is a common symptom or sign of the dehydration. Okay, so we did cover wormian bones or sutural bones, and what do we have here is that the wormian bones, notice that there are sometimes extra bones appear between those sutures, so that's why they're called sutural bones or the wormian bones. So I like to think of it this way. It's like little worms, and they're starting to wriggle around. Sometimes they form little circles. So these little bones are called wormian bones. And actually this is very interesting too. So again, this lambdoid suture looks more like a lambda. See, there's kind of more pointed like a Greek letter lambda. But there's also this interparietal bone, this wormian bone right here. I mean, so not everybody has these bones, but sometimes when these sutures form, you don't have the exact, you don't just form one line sometimes. Sometimes extra bones, or it traces out extra lines, and then you have this other extra bone inside. I mean, you still need it, otherwise you'd have a big gap inside your skull. But yeah, that's one of those things, like, you might know it, and you might have one, and you probably don't even know it unless you have like an x-ray, or someone needs, hopefully you don't need some sort of surgery on your skull. But yeah, so these are your cranial bones, again 8 total, and then let's talk about the ethmoid and sphenoid. So the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, you can all feel, and actually that's one of the ways I learned it when I was first learning anatomy. Like, at least the ones, I think the easiest anatomical structures are the ones you can palpate, the ones you can feel. So sometimes when I was like learning anatomy, I'd be like, okay, can I feel this part? Can I feel the structure? Because you have a skeleton inside your own body. So your body is kind of your own cheat sheet or crib sheet in its own way. Now the ethmoid and sphenoid, they're a little more complicated. So the ethmoid bone, I mean, if you took your eye out or took off your nose, maybe you could see it, but it's kind of hard to feel that part. So again, yeah, you don't want to be poking inside your eye. So your ethmoid does form part of the cranium. It does form like the bones that house your brain. Now the ethmoid, notice that this is like if you're looking at the very top of it. So what we're seeing is that there's all these little foramina. So remember, foramina is the plural of foramen. So these are all little tiny holes, and olfaction refers to your sense of smell. So remember that when you smell something, it goes inside your nose and your nasal cavity. But how does your brain inside that case actually detect it? Well, remember, whenever there's a hole or a depression or some sort of thing that's sunken in, it allows room for something. And in this case, it's allowing signals and these endings of these olfactory nerves to run through from the nasal cavity and carry these signals toward your brain. So this is why it's important to have these passages. And what we have here, Crista galli, that's one, it's like saying the comb of a rooster. But this look at another, yeah, so this is, again, if you have a foramen, it's usually allowing the passage of something. So here we have these olfactory nerve fibers that run from the inside of your nose and to what we call the olfactory bulb. We cover this more in detail in Unit 3 because we don't really cover the nervous system in depth for Unit 2. Okay, so this is actually looking at it. So we're going to look from the top of it and now turn it this way. So we're looking at the back of this same bone. So the ethmoid, it does have this very lacy, complex structure. And one way I can think, okay, if you're looking at it from the back surface of it, the posterior surface, it kind of looks like E turned on its side. At least that's what I think of it. It's like a very lacy calligraphy type of E. But yeah, this is one thing. Ethmoid does have an overall complex structure, but at the same time, it's because of that hole. Again, you need all those holes to carry or allow room for those nerves to pass through, and blood vessels as well. Alright, so then there's also the sphenoid bone, and actually there is visible from the outer surface of the skull, but only this part right here. So, but is it that tiny part? Well, actually, most of the sphenoid structure is within the skull, so it's the inner part. So what you can actually see is like, okay, it's actually toward the, like, yeah, it's very central in terms of the overall structure of the skull. And here's what the orbital surface, and it's hard to see, it might be hard to see if you have a very, in the book, but this is actually a smooth surface. Ethmoid bone considered regular? I believe so, yeah, because the ethmoid, it has a very complex straight shape. Same with the sphenoid, it's not quite flat, it doesn't quite fit the other categories of bones. And the classic structure, back to the sphenoid, is that it looks like I mean, some people don't get it and they say like, I don't get it, it doesn't look like it has wings, but anatomists, they call it wings. I like to think of it as like a winged bone, like these are big wings, and it's symmetrical, and it kind of looks like a butterfly or a bat. And what we have here with the orbital surface is that this part is smooth, but what would be fitting in here? That very squishy eyeball you have, right? So it kind of makes sense that this part would be smooth because your eye is moving all the time. So you want it to be smooth so that the tissues of the muscles and all the tissues that support the eye and the eye itself doesn't get shredded by a bony surface. Yeah, so I like to think it looks like a butterfly, or sometimes it might look like a bat. So I think it's like, and I think it looks like, either way, it looks like some sort of winged creature. And again, that's why we have the greater wings and the lesser wings. Now, what I really want you to know is this part called the sella turcica. So we're actually looking on the, like, if we took someone's skull, cut it open like this, and looked from the top and looked downwards, that's what we're seeing, the superior surface of the sphenoid. So either way, if you look at it from like the front or from the top, it kind of looks winged. Now, I like to think of it this way. So the sella turcica, it refers, I think it's Latin for Turkish saddle. And I'm like, okay, Turkish saddle, so it's a saddle, but I don't know what a Turkish saddle looks like. So I'm like, okay, this is what a Turkish saddle looks like, and I'm like, okay, it's a saddle, but I'm like, I don't get it. But the important part about this is it houses a very important gland, and it houses the pituitary gland, which is sometimes nicknamed the master gland. When the pituitary now is very important, and it controls a lot of hormones, not all the hormones in the body, but it does regulate how much of a lot of, like, you have many hormones in your body, and the pituitary gland kind of helps to coordinate how many levels of many hormones, not all, but many hormones in your body are regulated by the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is why it's important. So I like to think that, so as someone said, like, it looks like a bat, I think it looks like a bat too. I think it kind of looks like the bat plane, or bat, and then who sits in the bat plane? Batman. But who sits in the sella turcica? That would be pituitary gland man. So think of it that way. Like, okay, someone's got to sit in the seat, but instead of Batman, it's the pituitary gland. Yeah, so some sort of wing structure. So this pituitary gland sits right here. Alright, so we talked about the cranial bones. Now let's talk about the facial bones. So again, the brain's important, but also the entrances to your body are very important. But a little review. Quick top hat question. And this is a fill in the blank. Name any cranial bone. And just enter one, don't enter a list, because then it acts funny. Okay, let's see the responses, and yeah, it looks like most of you maybe something correct. I should add bone. Yeah, everyone who wrote this, yep, you're correct. Yeah, it looks like everyone answered correct, so great job. So again, these are all the cranial bones. Okay, back to our presentation. Alright, so now let's talk about the facial bones. So there are many facial bones, but this is what they are. So you have your vomer, you have your conchae, and it's very interesting because there's actually 3 pairs. Some people actually have a 4th pair of conchae, but these are the 3 standard ones you find in most people. So there's the inferior, superior, and middle, but usually in the anatomy books they refer to the inferior concha because the superior and middle are actually parts of the ethmoid bone. So again, another reason why that ethmoid has that very complex structure. It actually has 2 pairs of these conchae. Then you have your nasal bone, your maxilla, your mandible, the palatine, zygomatic, and lacrimal. So again, these aren't the ones that house your brain. These are the ones that protect your face. So the vomer, notice that, okay, we're looking at the base of the skull. So say we take a skull and we're looking at the inferior surface. We're looking at the bottom of it. So the vomer, it looks like a kind of what we have as a vertical plate. And it kind of looks like a very, very, very small and slender V. So think of it, vomer, it looks like a V that's right in the middle. So you can also see it down here. So the vomer is actually going to form the bottom part of what we call the nasal septum. So that divides your nasal cavity into a left and right hole, as we can see here. So yeah, you can see the vomer. If you get rid of the cartilage, get rid of all the tissue, and look in that part right there, you can see that part. Now the ethmoid, so what we have is the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha. So they're like scroll-like, very intricate and labyrinthine, and they're kind of like very lacy. And what they do is basically take the air that you're breathing in through your nose and swirl it around and cause what we call turbulence. So if you've been on a plane, you know, like when you encounter turbulence, that's when your plane starts to get bumpy because of all the air and the rough quality, the air swirling around, causing the plane to be shook around. So the conchae, that's their whole purpose, is to kind of disrupt the flow of air so that actually starts to swirl around in your nasal cavity. So think of it this way, it's like just like a conch shell has a very has a kind of like spiral-like structure and intricate structure. The conchae, actually they share the same Latin root, so that's what they call it. They're called conchae. Okay, so what we have are the superior and middle. So why are they colored green? Well, what we have here is so conchae is plural, concha is singular. So what we have here is the ethmoid in green. So they're actually, superior and middle conchae are actually part of the ethmoid bone. But the inferior nasal concha or conchae for plural, is actually considered its own thing. So it's not actually part of the ethmoid bone, it's not quite part of the maxilla, it's kind of considered its own separate structure. And this is a pretty, if you go further, if you have the Martini book, this is a pretty graphic image, but it's actually really good at showing the layout of these conchae and how they're kind of like this elaborate structure. So what we have here is the ethmoid and the vomer down here. So what we have here is the nasal septum that divides yours into left and right. Now what we have here as the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, they're actually extensions off the ethmoid, but notice that the inferior nasal concha, they're actually from the sides, so they're not quite they're not really part of the vomer, they're not part of the maxilla or the hard palate, they're not part of the ethmoid. So this is why it's considered, when you have, I think that depending on your resource, they might say okay, the conchae are a group by themselves, but yeah, notice that some of them are actually part of the ethmoid, but the inferior is pretty much considered in most textbooks by itself. And then you also have the meduses, yeah. So we cover this more next semester. So this is a nice diagram I learned. So one way you can think of the nasal cavity and the bones that form it. So the ethmoid is kind of like this E turned on its side. So pretend you have like an E and you turn it like this. So this is the ethmoid, and it forms the upper part of the nasal cavity and also that nasal septum. Then you have that vomer over here. So that vomer isn't quite, yeah, it's only the small little part right here. And then you have the, depending where you are, it can either be the palatine or the maxilla that forms the floor of the nasal cavity. Then superior nasal concha and then middle nasal concha. They're part of the ethmoid bone. And then you have the inferior nasal concha that's kind of its own structures by itself. And what do they do? Okay, so the cool thing is that they swirl the air, but as they swirl the air, they're able to warm it, humidify it. And if you've ever been in a very cold place that doesn't have a lot of humidity, if you ever try to breathe in the cold air by itself, you notice that sometimes it kind of hurts, right? Because again, it's going straight into your body and it's kind of going to shock all and cause all this temperature. Yeah, the cold temperature can hurt your lungs. I mean, it hurts to breathe sometimes if you're in a really cold and arid place. And the other bonus of this is that by swirling it around, you have all this mucus in your nasal cavity. So if there's anything like dust or bacteria or pathogens, it helps to trap that in the mucus by swirling it around so these particles end up trapped, and then the mucus can be blown out of your nasal cavity. Alright, so nasal bone, super easy, right? You can feel it right now. So the bridge of this right here, so you can feel that, okay, you have your cartilage over here for that forms some of your nose. That's why, like, when we pass away, that's why we have this whole big hole, but this part is left, this nasal bone's right here. And the mandible, so your jawbone or lower jawbone, this is what it is. So the mandible's down there. And let's see, the lacrimal bone, word wrapping. So it should be one. It ends with a L. But lacrimal, so whenever you hear that root word lacrima, or lacrim, that refers to tears. So what we have here is a lacrimal sulcus. Again, sulcus is a thin or shallow groove. And the nasolacrimal canal. So this is very important. When you think of lacrimal, think of tears. And what happens when you cry? Well, if you've noticed, like, if you ever cried and then you notice that this is one way you can tell, like, real tears from someone who's fake crying. Like, real crying is ugly. Like, ugly crying is like, it's like, okay, you're crying, but not only that, your nose is running, and then it's like everything's like wet, and then you're blowing out all these excess tears. So this is where part of it. So lacrimal bone helps to form this lacrimal sulcus, and that's why excess tears often drain to your nose because of this whole structure. We cover this more in detail when we cover the eye. But yeah, this is how you can tell someone's really ugly crying, is like, if their nose is running, they're probably for real crying, versus like someone who's just pretending to cry, but they're just like, if they don't have the snot going, I'm kind of suspicious of that. Okay, so maxilla, so the upper part. So like, think of that. You can think like, okay, you have your friend Max and they have a very thick mustache. Well, it's more than just the upper jaw. It does extend up here too a bit. Like, you can see it's kind of framing the nose a bit, and also the front of the face a bit. So the maxilla, that's what we have here. And then right here, but what about this? So notice that we have our zygomatic, and you can actually feel your zygomatic bone right here. So what we have is, like, if you have very prominent cheekbones, they might be, or if somebody wants a cheekbone implant for whatever reason, someone who has very sharp features and cheekbones, they probably have a very sharp zygomatic features right there. So you can feel your cheekbones right now. Hopefully everyone has a cheekbone. I mean, unless apologies if you don't have, but yeah, you can probably feel that right now. So zygomatic, or another way to remember is, like, think of it this way: when you say the word Z, what happens? Your cheekbones become more prominent. So think of it, when you say Z, then your cheekbones. Good way of showing it off. Now the palatine bone. So why didn't I label a bone in that previous, like, nasal cavity schematic? Well, it depends where you are in it. So what we see is that someone asked about the hard palate. So unless you're able to reach it all the way back here, the vomer isn't that part. So what's forming the upper part of the roof of your mouth, and that hard palate going from your front teeth, upper front teeth to the back. So you actually have the maxilla and the palatine bone. So common misconception is they think, okay, your hard palate is just the palatine bone. But actually, when you talk about the part that's actually, notice that the palatine bone forms a small part of the posterior part of your hard palate. The majority of the surface is actually the maxilla. So yeah, that's the thing, is the maxilla is more than just your upper lip. It's actually part of your hard palate, the majority of the surface of your hard palate as well. Okay, next top hat question. Let's go to that. So we covered a lot of these facial bones, and let's see, can you name one of them? Anyone? And you don't have to write out bone because we're just talking about bones. So just named it. Let's add a little more time. We're actually ahead of time. I'll take it. Okay, let's see what people said. And looks like we have pretty much all correct answers. I mean, let's see, maybe some misspellings, but looks like everyone's on the right track. So great job. Okay, so we covered our cranial bones, we covered our facial bones. So facial bones, now that we've covered them all, so these are your facial bones. Again, conchae referring to them in general, even though the inferior nasal concha is considered part of it. Like, we don't include, I mean, you could consider the ethmoid part if you're saying the conchae, yeah, using that as part of the conchae. But so this is Vicky, and notice that she's got laser eyes. So this is a great mnemonic. Vicky cannot make my pupils zap lasers. So this is another thing. I think she's zapping it from her face. So this is telling you all the first letters of all of these. But again, the conchae is a little twist because we're referring to those conchae that make up that are found within the nasal cavity. All right, so in the time we have left, let's talk about the orbital complex and several complexes in your skull. So the orbital complex, well, when you think orbit, you might think of, okay, we have a satellite and it's orbiting around our Earth. Well, with the orbital complex in your skull, think about this. You're orbiting around a round structure, round spherical structure, but this is the bone. So I think I was watching somebody doing one of the YouTube videos, but they were like making fun of somebody doing makeup, and they were saying the orbital bone, but actually we covered all the bones. There's actually many bones that make up this complex, so it's not just one singular bone that's just around the eye. Yeah, so again, think of it, the orbital complex is that structure that surrounds your eye or orbits your eye. So these are so the ones that are pretty easy to identify, like the frontal bone, the maxilla. So again, the maxilla is more than just your upper jaw. It actually extends a little and forms part of the anterior surface of the orbital complex. And your zygomatic. So they all kind of form a case that helps to protect the anterior of the eye. But you also have this is again why the sphenoid, the anterior surface, this part right here, is smooth, because again it's going to house that squishy eye and all the associated muscles and tissues and vessels. And then you also have the palatine, ethmoid, and lacrimal. These are the hardest ones to see, but they are part of that surface, that smooth surface that houses the eye. Especially the palatine, that one is tiny, but it's there. So these are the 7 bones that form the orbital complex that surrounds each eye. And why does it have all these holes? Well, the interesting thing is that your eye is like any other tissue. It needs its blood supply. It actually has a lot of nerves, and it actually has a lot of muscles as well. So you need room for all these vessels, nerves, and other soft tissues to run through. So that's why we have things like fissures, foramina, these grooves and canals, because you need something that connects your eye to everything inside your body and your skull and your brain as well. So this is why you have so many passages. I know it's very complex, but again, whenever you have a groove, a hole, or a bump, or not bump, a groove, hole, fissure, or some sort of passageway, it's allowing room for something to travel through. And there's the nasal complex, and we did cover some of these. So nasal cavities, what is the nasal cavity plus the paranasal sinuses form our nasal complex. So paranasal sinuses, they're actually very interesting. They're little small pockets within these bones. And you can actually see some of them over here. So notice that there's these little pockets. So these are sinuses. And then we have our frontal sinuses encased within the frontal bone, and the sphenoidal sinuses over here. There's also small little sinuses, sometimes called ethmoid sinuses, but more commonly ethmoid air cells. And this is what we see here. So the frontal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, maxillary sinus, and these ethmoid air cells. So they're all little pockets that form passages toward the nasal cavity. So, this is the very hardcore picture. So then even though it's kind of graphic, what I like about it is that you can actually see the conchae, you can see the meatuses in the nasal cavity, but you can also see the sinuses. So even though it's kind of like, the first time I saw this picture, I'm like, oh, I kind of need a moment here. But the thing is that, it shows these structures really well. That's why I show it. But why are sinuses important? Well, hopefully it's not due to coronavirus or due to flu, but when we catch a cold or say we have allergies, what can sometimes happen, sometimes our sinuses get plugged up and we're like, oh, it feels like I have a headache in my face. It feels like it's kind of in the back of the surface of your face, right? So what happens during sinus infection? Rod Rice, I have to look that up. Okay, so actually that's a really important little preview of next semester, and if you're going to the medical field. So whenever you have that last four letters, it refers to itis, I-T-I-S. That refers to inflammation. So with sinusitis, we have inflammation of our sinuses. So what we have here is a healthy sinus, but what happens during sinusitis? Well, again, if you had some sort of infection, respiratory tract infection that causes sinusitis, you might be like, oh, it feels like I have a pressure in my skull. And why does it feel like it's kind of toward the front of your skull? Because of all these sinuses being inflamed due to, again, that itis meaning an inflammation. And the tissues also swell with blood, and you also have this mucus, so that's why it kind of feels like you have a lot of pressure there. And you have all this mucus. It's very red. So a classic symptom of inflammation is that you have your immune system kind of delivering more blood and also causing the surrounding tissues being engorged with blood. And this causes the production of mucus as well in your sinuses. So what can you do to relieve sinusitis? Well, decongestant. So there's I think it's behind the counter, but still available if you ask for it. There's pseudoephedrine. So if you've heard of Sudafed, that's where it gets its name. But in terms of in front of the counter and over the counter, you can find phenylephrine. So phenylephrine is a little interesting history. So I remember pseudoephedrine used to be pretty popular and pretty easy to access. And when I was doing my master's in San Francisco, one of the other grad students, she asked me hey, can you buy me a box of pseudoephedrine? I have this cold for the third week, but they actually had a limit on how much pseudoephedrine you can actually buy. And you actually have to give your ID and driver's license and phone number because they place strict limits on how much boxes of pseudoephedrine you could buy. And I won't tell you which illicit drug it was, but apparently pseudoephedrine, through some backyard chemistry, can be made into illicit drug. And there was an epidemic of that going on in San Francisco at that time. I think that's why they were tracking you had strict limits on how much you could actually buy. My friend only needed it for the 1 week, so I wasn't thinking that she was up to that. But apparently like at the CVS or Walgreens that somebody was actually like there was a like a grandma or something with like 50 boxes of Sudafed, and they're like, okay, this is very, very suspicious. So that's why they put those limits. That's why phenylephrine is more common than pseudoephedrine now, due to people taking advantage of what should should be a easy thing, but yeah, it's crazy. All right, so what they do is activate these certain receptors on cells, and what it does is cause the constriction of blood vessels. So this is why part of the relief it provides. So again, during inflammation and sinusitis, you have all this blood rushing to the tissues of your sinuses. So if you constrict it and squeeze it and you limit the blood flow to that area, so it's going to cause those areas not to be, the tissues lining your sinuses not to be as swollen. And by doing that, that also decreases the mucus production in your sinuses as well. So that's why when you take pseudoephedrine or phenylephrine, you feel that relief of pressure because you don't have as much blood going to that area, and consequently you don't have as much mucus going to that area. All right, so axial skeleton to finish off. So the hyoid bone. So again, this is the larynx over here. So, or like in layman's terms, like the voice box. So just above your larynx, and don't squeeze too hard because it's like, but yeah, you would have a hard time feeling it because you actually have all these muscles and other tissues connecting your larynx to the surrounding areas. Or not the larynx, but the hyoid. So the hyoid is above. So if you have like what we call the laryngeal prominence or Adam's apple, a common name for that, just above that, that's where you would find the hyoid bone pointing just above it, superior to it, and this is where the horns would be pointing toward the posterior. So the hyoid is very special because it actually does not articulate, or in other words, it doesn't touch another bone. So this is why you don't see it in the previous diagram of the axial skeleton, because it would be floating in midair if you got rid of the rest of the tissues. Now, does that mean the hyoid is floating around in the rest of your body? Well, no, look at this right here. So what we see is that it's actually anchoring all these muscles and actually connected, there's some connective tissue as well. So even though the hyoid does not actually directly touch another bone, it's very important in anchoring a lot of these tissues, especially the muscles that control your tongue. And also it is very in controlling that little flap of elastic cartilage we call our epiglottis. So the hyoid is kind of like forming an anchor for many other tissues, and it's again not just floating randomly, it's actually holding all of this together. This is why you can see like all of these muscles here, they're actually they're named in part, or like a lot of them, it's like the hyoglossus, stylohyoideus, the geniohyoideus. They're all kind of like, it's just showing like the hyoid is important in anchoring all of those. And the larynx, so yeah, it's also connected via connective tissues and membranes. So the hyoid is very important. All right, so I think that's it for now. So yeah, so we covered the major bones of the skull. We also covered the hyoid briefly, and I think I'm actually going to leave the vertebrae for Wednesday. So wow, for once we're actually ahead of time. Okay, so I'll see you all on Wednesday, and take care of all your organ systems. Take care of your skeleton, take care of your respiratory system, your nasal cavities, and see you on Wednesday.